Welcome back to BrainWaves. I'm Jim Siegler. Today we're going to be discussing the origins of American neurology. I've got a friend of mine here on the show. Just introduce yourself and let us know who you are.
My name's Josh VanDerWerf. I'm a senior neurology resident along with Jim, and I'll be starting my neurocritical care fellowship this next summer. I happen to have an interest in history, and also we started a history of neurology interest group at our residency program here this last couple of years.
All right, so let's get to it.
So today we're going to talk about the origins of American neurology. Wanted to start off with a little poem that was penned by Walt Whitman in his work Passage to India in 1871. An excerpt from it goes, "The past, the infinite greatness of the past. For what is the present, after all, but a growth out of the past? As a projectile, formed, impelled, passing a certain line still keeps on, so the present, utterly formed, impelled by the past." Well, I felt like this poem eloquently related to us why the understanding of history could be important, because I believe history helps tell us where we came from, and by understanding where we came from, we can better understand where we are now, and maybe where we're headed in the future. I wanted to start off by trying to paint a picture for a setting for this story. I find that simply listing off dates, like in a history class, sometimes doesn't quite allow listeners or readers to transport themselves into those times, especially if you don't happen to be a history buff. So when you're studying the history of almost any modern medical discipline, the story often seems to pick up in the second half of the 19th century. This is also true of neurology. So what was happening in the world during this time period? In America, this time period was defined by two major themes. This was the time of the Wild West, as well as the Gilded Age. There was a migration from the East Coast to the West of adventurers who were mainly searching after riches, cheap land, new customers, new opportunities, and a new start. So this was the time of the Transcontinental Railroad being completed. Custer had his last stand in 1876, the same year that Wild Bill Hickok was killed playing poker while holding Dead Man's Hand, and Colorado became a state. So while all this Wild West action was happening that we all know from the movies and stories, there was also another great migration during the same time that was from the rural areas into the urban areas. Rapid industrial growth had led to increased wages for skilled workers, the growth of labor unions, and the influx of millions of European migrants. These immigrants were welcomed to Ellis Island with the site of the Statue of Liberty for the first time in 1886, and the Brooklyn Bridge was built just 3 years prior to this. So this period was also marked by extensive political corruption and huge wealth disparities. Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age to describe this scene. Some names you might recognize from this period include Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Edison, and other industrial giants, entrepreneurs, and inventors. In Europe, this time period coincided with the Victorian era and the Belle Epoch. New nations, Italy and Germany, were formed first in the 1860s and 70s. This was the time period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and cultural and scientific achievements. Tolstoy was writing about war and peace, Karl Marx was writing about a new social order, Charles Dickens about great expectations, and Van Gogh was painting starry nights in Paris cafes. It's no shock that medicine was flourishing in this environment. New discoveries were being made at a dizzying pace. Almost all of our beloved eponyms from the past originate from the same time period. So if you were a doctor living in the second half of the 19th century, the cutting edge of medicine wouldn't have related to things like genetics or targeted immunotherapy, but rather infectious disease. This period saw the move from what they called bad humors as a cause of diseases to germs. It was in the 50s that John Snow tracked the London cholera epidemic to the Broad Street pump, famously ushering in the field of modern epidemiology. In the 1860s, Lister finally published his antiseptic surgical technique. In 1882, Robert Koch identified the causative agent for consumption, the tuberculum bacillus, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1905. So initially, Europe dominated this medical landscape. American doctors interested in advanced specialty training would travel to Paris and Berlin, London, or Vienna to complete their training. They would spend time learning under famous physicians in their given field. It wasn't really until the early 1900s that American students even stayed in this country for their training, And then eventually Europeans even started coming here for training. So neurology, specifically in Europe at this time, was mainly in two models, a growth out of psychiatry in Vienna and a growth out of internal medicine in France. In Vienna, you'll recognize names like Meynert, Chiari, Virchow, Alzheimer, and Wernicke. In France at the time, at the famed, I'm going to butcher this name, but La Salpêtrière Hospital, you'll recognize Charcot and his friends named Babinski, Broca, Geoffroy, Tourette, Duchesne, and Desjardins. All of these people were living in the same time period and experiencing some of the things we listed earlier. So hopefully what we've talked about so far has helped you picture this period and perhaps even place yourself there. So how did American neurology come into this story? The story of American neurology specifically involves two men in one pivotal historical event in U.S. history. You might remember that immediately preceding this grand age of prosperity and peace, industrial, cultural, and scientific growth that we've been talking about was something very destructive and dark, American Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed, which was nearly 1 in 12 of all adult men of the time. Countless more were injured by .58 caliber projectiles fired from rifles, which were causing horrendous injuries to limbs, which you might imagine resulted in a gamut of neurological injuries. It was in this crucible that American neurology had its origins. So in the middle of this war in 1862, Abraham Lincoln named a man named William Hammond U.S. Surgeon General at age 34. He was born in Annapolis. He grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He received his medical degree at NYU and was actually a resident at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. He later became friends with another man named Silas Weir Mitchell. S. Weir Mitchell was born in Philadelphia, received his medical degree at Jefferson. They both shared an interest in the nervous system early on and actually wrote a paper together on poisons affecting the nervous system before the war. So after becoming Surgeon General in the war, Hammond instituted many reforms and started these focused military hospitals. One of these was named Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia. He asked his friend S. Weir Mitchell to run the place, and it became the first American site of focused neurologic investigation. While working at Turner's Lane, Mitchell meticulously studied the breadth of traumatic peripheral nerve injuries during the war. In doing so, he described causalgia, erythromelalgia, and phantom limb, among other disorders. Immediately afterwards, he published a seminal work on peripheral nerve disorders. Causalgia is known today as complex regional pain syndrome or reflex sympathetic dystrophy, and erythromelalgia is a rare disorder which causes severe pain and erythema of the hands, which is also known as Mitchell's disease. Mitchell's publications on these topics brought international attention to American neurologists, primarily in France and England. Turner's Lane closed after the war, but then S. Weir Mitchell helped establish the Philadelphia Orthopedic and Infirmary for Nervous System Diseases and developed an extensive private neurology practice. He also happened to serve as the first president of the Philadelphia Neurological Society, which had its first meeting in 1884. If you live in the area, you may not know it's still meeting regularly to this day. This meeting was frequented by many notable physicians, including William Osler during his time at Penn. Aside from his contributions to neurology, S. Weir Mitchell was also a well-known and prolific writer, which many people don't know. He is counted among the leading American authors of this time period and wrote several volumes of verse and historical novels, including Hugh Wynne, Free Quaker, and The Red City. Despite his international recognition and extensive publication record, however, he never held a university professorship. Today, however, despite ever holding a university professorship, S. Weir Mitchell is known as the father of American neurology. So what about William Hammond? After the war, he moved to New York and worked at Bellevue Medical College as well as New York State Hospital. In 1871, he wrote a book called The Treatise on Diseases of the Nervous System, which was the first American neurologic text, which is still cited today. Importantly, he was also the key to founding the American Neurological Association, or the ANA as it's known today, in 1874. S. Weir Mitchell, his friend, was also one of the charter members. The first meeting was actually hosted by William Hammond in his lavish Manhattan home over dinner, which they continued to do over the course of the initial first meetings. Like Mitchell, he was also a prolific writer and heavily involved in promoting public awareness of neurology as a distinct field of medicine He would even write articles about neurology in popular non-scientific periodicals, similar to today's Scientific American. So following these two gentlemen, Mitchell and Hammond, were other leaders in the field. C.K. Mills in Philadelphia, James Putnam in Boston, James Stewart Jewell in Chicago, Francis Miles in Maryland, and Bernard Sachs, who we know of from Tay-Sachs disease in New York, among many others. And actually, Bernard Sachs was also the one who wrote the first pediatric neurologic textbook in 1895. So as you can see, this combination of publications, textbooks, organizations, and specialized hospitals and training programs over the course of time after the Civil War really helped form American neurology as a field and gave it recognition on an international level during this grand age at the end of the 19th century. Hopefully, this talk has given you a new appreciation and understanding of not only the origins of American neurology, but also history in general. I'm quoting Whitman again, "For what is the present, after all, but a growth out of the past?"
That was a very interesting account of the origins of American history, Josh. So what I'm taking away from it is, if I'm a poet who does not hold a professorship, but decides to create something and build an organization upon it, a podcast, then I can become famous for what I do. Is that effective for me to become famous?
It just might be, if the past has anything to teach us for today. You're on the right track.
Again, that was Dr. Joshua VanDerWerf at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, neurocritical care fellow to be, and historian. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Thanks for listening to BrainWaves today. If you like what you just heard, you can find more related material on the web at brainwaves.me or find us on Twitter at brainwavesaudio. Feel free to contact us at bweditorialboard@gmail.com. Be sure to check out our iTunes archive for older episodes. This episode was produced by Jim Siegler. Music by the Advent Chamber Orchestra. Josh Woodward. I'm Erica Mejia. Join us next time for another edition of BrainWaves.